Hello, hello. LinkedIn land. We are live. It's great to see everybody getting on the chat. Sorry, we had a few connection issues, but we're really delighted to have everybody here. And we're going to jump right in. So we're talking about adapting to disruption, navigating the future of learning in the digital age. And I am thrilled to have Giovanni Salas and Chris Evans here with us, some of the executives from Pollinate Networks here to join us today. And we have a few things that we want to talk through, but we also want to invite everybody to dive in and talk along with us and send us comments and ask your own questions or make your own statements. So welcome, everybody. I'm going to start by introducing Chris Evans. So I first encountered Chris. Gosh, Chris, how long ago was that? Maybe 20 years ago, easily?
Easily 20 years, yep.
A long time ago when Chris was an executive in youth development. Since he's been doing lots of work in learning and development, mergers and acquisitions, and he is an advisor and mentor to many. And Chris is one of my very favorite conversation partners in the world because we have such good conversations, and Chris has so much insight into so many things. So Chris, I'm really delighted that you're here today. And Giovanni Salas, Giovanni. And if you want to know more about any of us, obviously you're just a click away from our LinkedIn profiles. But Giovanni, I hesitate to call you this, but Giovanni is my long-suffering business partner and co-founder here at Pollinate Networks. We've been working together for, gosh, almost 20 years as well, Giovanni, by this time. And I love working with Giovanni because he's got, for one thing, all kinds of experience with tech businesses as our CTO and as a technology entrepreneur. He's got a lot of insight into past, present, future in terms of what's been happening in technology. And also, we've really communed around this whole topic of mentorship and knowledge collaboration, knowledge transfer. And Giovanni has a PhD in that area and has been so generous with all of his expertise with us over the years. So welcome to both of our panelists. Thank you so much for coming, and wild applause, wild applause. Let's jump right in because I know we were a little bit late getting started, but I want to set the stage. And Chris, I thought you might be able to help us to do that. And I want to talk about the fact that, you know, when we think about times of disruption and being adaptive to that disruption, like the times that we're in now, logically, learning and development should be a major tool in the toolkit for dealing with change, for dealing with ambiguity, for dealing with disruption. And yet, we know from our own experiences and research and talking to our clients and so on, that learning and development is still one of the first things to get cut when organizations feel like they're under pressure. So why is learning and development still seen as a necessary evil and not a major asset? Why are we still here after all these years?
Yeah, and I think, Christy, great question. It's one I give a lot of thought to, and I think it feels like we're in the same space, but I think really we're in a different space that feels the same. And the way I think about answering that question is a little bit of like, you know, if you think about we're in the river, an L&D team in the river in this boat, and the boat feels like it's the same experience, even though it's way further downstream. So it might be helpful to, if you think about that analogy to as we think about that, the future, right, is understanding the stream that we're flowing in. And I kind of think about it over the last 15 years has really been my career paying a lot of attention both to the practice of L&D and the market. And if you think about 15 years ago, and again, I'm describing kind of the mean of like the Fortune 1000 as like you have outliers around that, but the reality was you had a shift from a training department to learning and development starting to occur, right? And learning development got a label, it got a seat at a table. People, you know, I describe it as a little bit of like the shift from we have to have training, therefore train people in compliance to, oh, we should have learning and development, think about our people as an
Yeah,
asset.
I remember when we started asking people what they might want to learn. That was a new thing, performance consulting as opposed to training. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think at that period, if you think about the start of the river, the focus was still on how to learn, right? And I would say probably until mid 2015, 2016, that was the focus for L&D. And then you started to see a shift as the war for talent heated up. And we kind of went through this period of a war for talent and a zero interest rate environment in business, where you actually, for a lot of us in that, saw budgets for things grow. In that business cycle, the amount of money invested go, but you still lived in this kind of like on the reins, off the reins, on the reins, off the reins. It wasn't a line item like facility maintenance is in the budget that we don't touch, right? It wasn't, in marketing driven companies. And what happened in that time though, is you got more investment, is you got a shift from, I think, and we're still in the middle of this disruption of L&D people being tell us how to learn, to this move, which you saw as the war for talent went and disruption started to ramp, not just tell us how to learn, but more of a focus on what to learn, right? And the pressure for L&D grew as the investment went up, but I think most of us in the space would go, you still had, if I think about this river experience, this logic gap between the level of investment and the expectation of the outcome, right? Which is now we want L&D. And if you think about where we've sat for the last 5 years of crazy disruption, we went from make my people better to make my organization better in this war for talent. And we cared about competency, but L&D also directly got the culture monkey. They've got the collaboration and teamwork monkey. There's this kind of humongous pressure. And now as we sit at this next level of disruption, the pressure on predicting the future and what to learn just keeps going up. And executives, like I spend a lot of time on both sides of this equation, the executives who allocate the funds, right? And I bounce between that, like capital allocators go, we're investing more in our people than we ever have before. We expect a higher and higher and higher outcome. And L&D people look and go, you expect a higher and higher outcome. Your investment hasn't kept track with the level of infrastructure and resources you need to get that outcome. And that's why I think from my perspective, especially as you think about what we just went through, right? COVID, shift to hybrid work. It's like, hi, we're going to reinvent all of how we operate as human beings and how we work in like 5 years. And could you please do that on, a average budget of, blow your mind, I think for the Fortune 1000, it's under $1,000 now, right?
So Chris, I'm curious to get your perspective. In Canada, particularly, they've been talking for many years now the decline of productivity, and the decline of productivity is associated with lack of investments in equipment, in tools, that kind of thing. But another aspect is the lack of investment in education, and as we know, education has played a key role for societies, for nations, how to attract capital and everything else. And it seems like the news are not getting better for Canada, particularly for Canada, as far as the level of productivity of our population. What's your perspective with that and this investment in learning and development, or lack of investment?
Yeah, I think I would have a two-part perspective on it. The first is the level of investment is less important than the coherence around the goal and the environment of investment. So I think if you think about Western society, Canada in particular, is better trained, better educated than at any point in the history of civilization, right? So but we are reducing our level of productivity. Why? Well, education and training by itself doesn't translate to productivity. right?
I was going to say that too, Chris, is that like the step between, it happened and wow, everybody's so much better. There's a big gray area of doubt in there for people. And sometimes they don't see the return.
Yeah. And so I think, Giovanni, like, first of all, you have to, if you take Canada relative to the US as an example, like we have less innovators, we have less tool creators, we don't incubate innovation and value creation at anywhere near that level. And we've also created an environment, like it's over the last 10 years, if you look at capital allocation, foreign direct investment, like we've gone from in over 10 years, basically parallel to the US on a per capita basis to a fraction of that investment in the US. So it's no wonder we've got really well trained and educated workers, but they're less productive. And because training and education by itself doesn't incubate productivity.
That's a great point, Chris. I like it. And I think these are really important points to consider, the milieu we find ourselves in and the macro environment that learning and development exists in. I know one of the things that I hear a lot from leaders is, they want sure things. They want people to be better. They're struggling with the generations and so on. And we know that disruption increases distraction. And heck, 30 years ago when I started out in learning and development, we were already talking about the forgetting curve that everybody puts up on their LinkedIn or blogs about, where you walk away from a session and you only remember a small amount, 2 weeks later. And it's really hard to keep people focused and to help them understand what is the critical knowledge and the critical application that's required. So Giovanni, based on your research and experiences, give us some ideas about, what are some real best practices around knowledge transfer that help people share knowledge effectively so people can actually remember what is going on and what they need to apply when they walk away, when they go back to their regular life.
That's an excellent question, Christy, and that's something that companies and organizations have been asking for many years. But at the same time, is the knowledge sharing has been part of humans for a very long time. That's how we were able to form societies. That's how we were able to form groups. That's how we were able to run companies, right? It's by collaborating, by cooperating, by sharing the knowledge. Chris mentioned it, with the pandemic, it brought a whole new dimension with remote work and hybrid work, and how do people continue to share. We also do have the experience before from 25 years ago, when everybody was talking about knowledge management and how we were going to document everything, and everything was going to be in computers, and therefore very easy for people to learn, only to find out that, wow, it didn't work, or it had limited impact. And it worked in some cases, but in most cases, people didn't work. Why is that? It's because people like to learn from each other. And that's a key element. So when organizations think about knowledge transfer, they have to think about, how do we ensure that people are in an environment where they could actually share knowledge, and creating, and not just expecting that that's going to happen, but actually designing opportunities, designing programs for them to engage in that type of activity is going to be very beneficial. People through all of our lives, we learn from others, and new research shows that babies start learning from their mothers like within hours. Before it used to be, oh no, they have to be many months or whatever before they start learning. That's not the case now. They know that they start learning within hours. And in some ways, at the school, we learn from our classmates. At home, we learn from parents, from siblings. No wonder that at work, so we also learn from our coworkers. having this idea, and if you all reflect back to your work days, I'm sure that you can think of several examples of people that you love working with. And you love working with these individuals because you were able to learn from them.
Mm-hmm.
You learned how to conduct a meeting, how to be part of a team, how to manage a team, how to when to talk, when not to talk. All of those things we are learning from others, and that will be an essential part for organizations to consider: is how do you set up programs, how do you design initiatives that allow people to share that knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think a couple other things that I've heard you say over the years too are learning from each other, for sure, learning in the context that the skill actually has to be performed. And I know a lot of your work and research, Giovanni, has been around competencies. How do people build competencies? And I loved the example you gave when we were working on a competency project. It's one thing for a doctor to be, or a medic to be able to do stitches in the office. What about in the back of an ambulance? What about, during an air raid? What about all these other situations? So being able to apply in context with that social support is important. And I think also I've heard you say, applying or learning when we're about to apply can be helpful so that we don't have to aggregate and we don't have to wait too long.
Absolutely. It's exactly what you said, learning how to apply this. Again, training courses do a good job in bringing information forward. And now with that part of the disruption that Chris started to talk about it, and we're experiencing with AI, everybody's talking about how AI is bringing all of this information together, right? We're talking now about potentially AI coaches, all of that. But the key thing here is, can we put things into context? Can we actually, do you have the opportunity to apply it immediately or very soon? Because we are very good at forgetting things.
Yes,
we are. If we don't use it, we just forget that. So being able to do now, one of the key things to help you with that is also when you think about experience. You learn by doing things. You think now, many times we don't have the opportunity to have the experience, and we don't know how to gain that. That's where somebody working with a mentor becomes very important. Mm-hmm. Because a mentor is not just somebody that's going to give you information. A mentor is somebody that's going to share experience. And again, as human beings, I go back to how we love to mimic. When somebody shares an experience with us, it almost feels, not quite, but it almost feels like, wow, I can feel that. I can relate to that. Mm-hmm. And the importance of working with somebody that can put those things into context, that has experienced that's powerful.
Absolutely. Well, and that's a nice segue to the next curiosity I have, and asking both of you, but let's go to you, Chris, in terms of we can't avoid the discussion about AI, and at Pollinate, we're all about mentoring programs, collaborative learning, bringing the best of artificial and human intelligence together to find the right places, people, etc., to make that happen. We're sometimes asked now though, if we have a mentor bot. One prospect was so bold as to say, we don't actually want to have humans step out of their day-to-day to advise other humans. We would rather just have a mentor bot that does that. So of course we want the best merger of these things, and cross-pollinate AI is all about that. But what would be wrong with sort of saying, relying predominantly on AI to mentor your leaders and your team members? What are the risks of that?
Yeah, there's a lot. Maybe I recall a conversation I recently had with a pretty senior CLO where we were wrestling some of this to the ground. So I think to answer your question, my answer depends a little bit on agreeing with the shift that I see happening in the imperative for learning. right? And the learning organization. If you think about the pressure on organizations, like what's that pressure going to look like, that you need to do that. So let me back up and maybe give a bit of quick thinking on that. I think if you think about the level of disruption we've just been through, and it's everybody I read and think that goes, it's going to get worse, and in ways we don't know how, right? As humans, we're not great at predicting. We're much better at adapting, right? So you don't know what shifts are going to occur, but you probably then can bet on the winning organizations for the foreseeable future. 3-5 years probably is the biggest window you could do for that, are going to be the ones that adapt the fastest and properly and what I'll call healthily integrate these technology shifts and also the cultural shifts, right? Whether you want to, I think Neil Ferguson called it the vibe shift, right? There's a lot of adaptation that has to happen really, really, really quickly, right? So if you're then the chief people officer of a company and you're thinking about how do I build that adaptive capacity, right? Build that resiliency or anti-fragility into my organization, right? That if you agree that that's the objective, and then you go, okay, well, fine, I'm just going to outsource everything to AI. My content is all going to be AI driven, large language model. Like we're going to outsource thinking to ChatGPT. So our learning content on leadership, might be prompted differently, but it's going to be the mean in that. The reality is you're basically going, okay, I'm going to adapt mean thinking throughout my organization. So that's the first danger. So not to say, and I actually think AI should permeate a lot of learning and development. Like there's a lot of efficiencies to be gained. But your first is if you just outsource everything to it, you're going to adopt mean thinking in a time where for your organization to win, you actually have to resiliently, creatively create new forms of value and capture new forms of value and adapt faster than the competition. And mean thinking isn't going to get you there. So that's the first danger. I think the second danger is with a carte blanche strategy. And to be clear, I actually think there's a lot of places you should use AI, right? Custom content is an obvious one. There's a lot of places you could do it. But I think if you think about if winning organizations are the ones that adapt the fastest and the labor market is going to be disrupted, kind of by default, winning employees are going to be the ones that adapt the fastest and are able to create and capture new value. And I think like a lot of the generative AI that's there is helpful for a lot of those tasks. But to really create and capture value, it's not just about knowledge, right? It's about, I do a lot of work with a lot of different entrepreneurs. And the difference between entrepreneurs that are successful and entrepreneurs that fail isn't their knowledge base, right? It's their ability to, I was on a call this morning early with one who's like, I feel sick to my stomach and I need help moving forward because I'm like, he has a phenomenal opportunity, but it's scary as all get out, right? AI is not going to help you with that internal character to put one foot in front of the other, march through the risk, deal with the challenges, overcome the obstacles, that kind of aspirational piece. AI can help him with the, how do I prepare my pitch? But it's not going to help him be trustworthy to the venture capitalist that he's pitching to. You can be coached by the AI to do the content. You got to be mentored for somebody who's actually had to go ask somebody for $2 million of risk capital, right?
Yeah, that information plus inspiration, equation.
So whether they're an entrepreneur out in the market or an intrapreneur in your company, like that kind of task, I would say, is where organizations adapt at the pace that their people adapt at, and therefore there's a non-informational part of adaptation, right? It's whether you want to call it wisdom, situational judgment. I've heard Giovanni call it tacit knowledge, but there's a lot of like, I'm here and I gotta integrate the emotional intelligence, the cognitive intelligence into something that and take a risk to go and push past that mean thinking. So I think that's your second risk as a CLO. And then I think the third risk is for organizations right now not to pay attention to one of the critical roles they're playing in our society. Institutional trust is at an all-time level across a lot of boards. And I would say if you're a significant employer, you are probably next to family, the primary source of community for a lot of your employees.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And sure, teamwork serves a little bit of that, but I think the other thing I would say, and not everywhere, not all the time, but organizations are part of a social contract with their employees, that if you're not paying attention to that connection, you're not paying attention to how you create kind of those great communities. I would say what will happen, again, a little bit being a predictor here, but the problem is if you just go full bore and you strip all the humanity out of your learning strategy, your top people aren't going to stay, right? You'll end up, if you think about a bell curve of talent, right, you'll end up shrinking the bell curve. So it'll still be distributed, but around a smaller mean. And those top performers are going to go work somewhere else. I just read a fascinating article actually around McKinsey, Accenture, and some predictions around what's going to happen to their talent base as they start to lose these government contracts that have have paid the bill for this big massive. And one of the data points they gave is it's something like doubling every 2 years the pace of independent consultancies that are top quartile consulting performers that have gone out and said, like, why do I work in this big, chaotic, crazy system when I can go form my own high impact community, charge the same amount of money in the private sector, reduce all of the bureaucracy, the non-human parts of work, and build a really high capacity human organization that does all of that. And I think that third piece, right, organizations need to pay attention to, and my prediction would be your learning strategy, which is just a subset of your people strategy. If you don't pay attention to that and look at the intentional places you're putting that in, that's probably a big risk, right? And all of it is, big companies reverting to average mean AI thinking. And at which point you're very, very, very vulnerable to just outsourcing your entire value proposition to a large language model.
It's true. It's true. I love how you said that, Chris. I hadn't thought about it in exactly those terms, but we saw people go to e-learning en masse, a number of years ago. And to Giovanni's earlier point, that kind of, yes, it's good for the information, but it robs us of some of the connection. The large language models are fun to play with. It's great to have your robo coach to, try out your difficult conversation with and so on. But it's not the same. I think we were all in agreement on that. And I think it's what you're saying about the value proposition, the employment value proposition, and that social contract we have with our team members has never been more important for us in terms of helping people manage this change and turbulence. And, the coming generations too, the millennials, the Gen Zs, and so on, learning seems to be at the top of their list whenever we interview new team members or, get involved in helping with recruitment or whatever with clients. There's always, a real drive to learn with those folks.
Yeah. And I think, Christy, just maybe to make sure I'm making the point clearly, I think a false dichotomy is AI bad or good for learning, right? The way I kind of think about it, for healthy organization, use the analogy of diet. And if you kind of pair digital content and AI, you've now got this capacity with generative AI to create crazy amounts of content. Is that content bad? right? And if you were to think about that as the equivalent of like ultra processed foods or synthetic, like a lot of those synthetic foods, well, first thing is like not all ultra processed or synthetic foods are equivalent of bad, right? There's garbage,
there's range,
medium quality, and then there's organic food, right? And in the same way, like not all organics are going to be great for you, but the way I think about it is like, how do you get healthy as a human consuming food, right? Diet, right? Well, garbage in, garbage out, like get rid of the bad stuff, right? Whether it's synthetic or organic, right? And then for most of us, unless you can afford a private jet, you're going to have some percentage mix of processed foods and organic foods. And probably if you're eating an all processed diet, you're not going to be very healthy.
Find out about it. Yes.
Right. But it doesn't mean that all processed is bad. In fact, most of our week probably are 50, 60% processed. It's just like, okay, how do I make sure I keep having like real food in my diet?
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely.
Well, and it's interesting you clarify that. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Giovanni.
So one of the key things that you brought up, Chris, is that you can take all of this information, and AI is going to play a key role in making all of that information available, and everybody has access to it, and everybody at the end can learn it and use it at different degrees, different levels, but it's available to everyone. That's not what has differentiated the great companies or the great ideas or the great solutions. It is just sometimes it's a team that comes out with something unique. Sometimes it is an individual within the organization. So how do you encourage that? Or how do you set up the environments to do that for these teams, for these individuals to go beyond just the information or the coaching that AI can give you, but for them to become very creative, very innovative, and sometimes being able to work with a mentor, somebody that has experienced that, could be the difference.
Yeah.
This young entrepreneur you were talking to said, I feel sick having to go and ask for $2 million. If somebody else says, yeah, I remember it happened to me 20 years ago. And this was my physical reaction, and this is what I did to overcome. What a great lesson that would be.
Yeah, and that social support and normalization, that's such a huge somatic reset for people that allows them to learn. We can't learn when we're triggered all the time.
Yeah. And like that, the big ask, right? Like what 0.1% of people ever go ask somebody for $2 million. But it's an easier way to illustrate, I've got to go ask for a promotion. I've got to ask for a raise. I've got to go have a difficult conversation with a team member. Like AIs can give you some of the content, and they can probably even, like some of them now are getting faux empathy into that. But I think that's not the same, right? I personally, as I've had somebody who's walked that journey ahead of me, and it might not be the same journey, right? Like I tend to try and on most topics, get 4 or 5 mentors, right? And even have reverse mentors, right? And have somebody who's been on the other side of something that went really bad. But that set of data points, right, are human to human. It's not,
Yes.
I got a large language model to give me the 10 points I need to relay. Like I'll use it for the clarity once I figured out but I've still got there's a whole category of kind of unconscious competency and unseen nuance to most situations. The
machine can't infer yet. The machine can't infer yet. And Giovanni, one of the things that we've been reading a lot about is, people actually losing ground on critical thinking skills and so on because they're over relying on tools to do it for them. And, we've already talked a little bit about some of this stuff, but what else do you see as, what's that? And Josh Berzin calls it the rise of the super worker, someone who is AI informed, but also building their own skill set, not relying on AI. What is your version of that, Dr. Salas? How would you advise people?
There's a couple of things to keep in mind, and I know we've been, every generation has talked about the new generation as not being the same, as not thinking the same, as not being hard workers as the previous generations. But we do have to admit that we have an enormous amount of distractions, and more so we can see it even when with our children. I have children that are into their 30s that they didn't grow up with a cell phone, and I see some of my friends have children that they did. When we were growing up, we obviously had a lot of distractions, but not to the degree that they have now. And there is a lot of research now, still a lot more to be done, how the brains are being rewarded for some of the new generation, and how we need that constant stimulation that digital devices provide to be able to function. Some people have gone even as far as saying, there is an addiction element to this. Again, lots of studies still to be done in that area. But given all of that, and also there were some other things that organizations did, 15, 20 years ago, well, I guess not 20, but 15 years ago, 10 years ago, the Facebooks, the Googles of this world decided to have this massive open office spaces for people to go and do that. So again, there is somebody else, a telephone rings, somebody else is talking, that doesn't allow you to have that. And I love the idea of the super workers being able to focus, to concentrate, because that is a skill, and it is a skill. It cannot be underestimated how difficult it is. And I would challenge all of us to try to go 1 or 2 hours without your phone, without your computer, just actually thinking about something, trying to solve a problem. And you're going to find out that it's difficult to do it. There's no question about that. So that is something that you do need to practice. You need to approach, the way that I like to think this is, you need to approach it like a craftsman. And if you reflect back into craftsmanship, the craftsman would actually think about something and approach always the tools, the project, with respect, but also with time. It's said there's nothing that when you see a nice whatever it is, that they have taken the time to do it. And that's something that I think it's one of those things that you could practice. So can I allocate a couple of hours a day to do some deep thinking, to do some analyzing, to do some, and to practice that. And it's true. Like you, Christy, I have heard from many clients that, I don't know if my people have critical thinking. I don't know if they lack common sense. And it is not something that we're born with.
It's not, and it is something that we've seen, Giovanni, mentorship really helps with, because you have someone challenging your thinking, as opposed to the tendency of our electronic devices to just serve up more that's already in our echo chamber, if you will.
Absolutely. And remember, the whole point of the digital engagement is to create more and more engagement. When you meet with a mentor, when you have a good mentor, it's actually even that time. It's time for reflection, time for learning, time to discuss ideas, right? Even that becomes a very important part of your learning and development. To be able to have somebody, don't call it a mentor, call it a colleague or a friend, whatever, but just take that time without the disruptions of digital devices to just share ideas.
Well, we got just a few minutes left, so I want to ask our panelists for any closing remarks or anything that you want to for sure emphasize when we're thinking about this. We're all trying to adapt to a lot of disruption, and how do we get the very best out of our learning opportunities? Chris, why don't you get us started?
Yeah, and I wanted to dive into another thing Giovanni just said, so I'll maybe just fold it in and then you can pick it up. We'll play a little tennis here, but I think the first thing is as if you're in an organization as a learning professional, think about have really clear, mutually agreed upon set of outcomes. My high encouragement would be, things like competency frameworks that take 1.5 years to develop. Like by the time you get it approved, it's probably irrelevant. So you're going to have to, in times of disruption, I think the function becomes more important, but only if it's focused on the outcome and the business value and kind of those first order principles of what's not going to change in that, right? Adaptability is always going to have organizational value. Understanding where you can create customer value from your chair in the organization, always going to have tons of value. I think the other thing, and this was the point I was going to bounce off of Giovanni, right? In addition to everything he said, I have 4 kids, right? And I describe it as like a blend of hive mind and brain rot, where we spend so much of our time in this digital ecosystem that's algorithm driven. There's a lot around it. But back to that, if your goal is to have more people think critically, like good critical thinking is often contrarian thinking, but not like superficial devil's advocate. I mean, like well-researched thought, and it means like true diversity of opinion and thought, where you've had the opportunity to reflect and do that deep work. And it's why 𝗏𝗏𝗃𝗏, Christy, who you and I used to work for, right? Mm-hmm. It's like less content, more learning. Mm-hmm. Like thinking about like what that deeper piece, right? The really clear, simple, deeper, well thought through contrarian thoughts, like that actually takes a lot of time and space and work to do in the hive mind, right? It's actually kind of stripping away. And if I was a CLO today in a bigger company, I personally would be thinking about how do I create more of that space that's actually value add. And for me, I don't know any way to do that without a really good thought partner. Like I need quiet thought partner, like to me. Mm-hmm. And so those are folks I often call mentor because I want them. But sometimes it's reverse mentoring, and I've got somebody who me talking it through is great. But I would be thinking about how do I create a lot more space than I probably have for that in my learning strategy.
I think one of the key things there too, Chris, is recognizing that you actually have the resources to do it, and the knowledge to do it. Like we've been doing that again as humans, we've been doing that for thousands of years.
Yeah,
that's how we evolve. That's how we form communities, by learning from each other, by growing together. An organization is not different right now. You do have the people there that have the experience, that have the know-how, and it's not all. I guess the part that I keep referring back is not just technical experience. It is knowing the organization, knowing who are the key players, knowing who knows what. What this person likes, what this person does not, is that cultural knowledge, that internal knowledge. Yeah. And you have that. You have that already in your hands. It's being able to create those spaces to give the employees, particularly the new employees, the opportunity to learn from others.
And that's something, Giovanni, that we see over and over again, that people don't, it's not necessarily easy for everybody to self-organize that. We have lots of people out there saying, oh, it's easy to get a mentor. You don't need, any software or anything. It's not necessarily easy for people to do that at the right time and in the right way. So it's an interesting question.
And I would build off that point, Christy. Like I sit on a board of a youth development organization, so I get a lot of the insight. Like one of the major one of the major shifts, Giovanni, that I think you and I have talked about, so I know you agree, is like I think the generations that are coming in, it's not, you know, they get a lot of bad labels, but they have grown up in an ecosystem where they have to do less work to self-organize relationship. Like you just think about the proliferation of dating apps, right? And so probably my last one, if I was a CLO, is I agree with all of your points, but I would be thinking about, depending on the generation, right, that they are doing less and less and less work to organize relationship and connection. And how do I reduce that friction so that it happens is probably another thought which is why Pollinate excites me to be involved in, right? Because it's like a little bit of friction reduction increases the percentage, right? Like the way I think about it is like 10% of people in your organization are going to self-organize to get the inputs they need: mentors, coaching, content, new learning, reading.
No, absolutely,
right?
please. I would agree with that. And I would go actually further to say, you know, as an organization, you have to intentionally create these programs, intentionally create these environments, intentionally design, give the opportunity to employees to actually do this. It's not going to happen by itself because of all of the disruptions, because of all of the pressures that we have, the uncertainties that we face. You have to be able to set up these programs and give them the opportunity to actually share knowledge.
I think that we've gone on to 47 minutes, and this is so interesting and you know, great sharing. I'd love to go on, but I think in respect for time, we'll just thank our panelists. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Giovanni, for such a great conversation, and leave you with the idea of, you know, we want investment to meet opportunity when it comes for learning. And there's all kinds of ways that people can get content, but we know to apply it. Having that, I love that image you gave of, you know, reflection, collaboration pieces are going to be really important. So thanks again to our panelists, and looking forward to continuing the conversation with all of you out there in LinkedIn, YouTube, Instagram land. Take good care.
Thank you.
Thank you.